The auction block stood in the center of Wyatt, Wyoming territory, and Florence Pruitt stood upon it with her chin held high. Though inside she felt herself crumbling like old adobe in a rainstorm. The year was 1878, and the late August sun beat down mercilessly on the gathered crowd, making the air shimmer with waves of heat that seemed to mock the coldness in every pair of eyes turned toward her. She was 23 years old, a widow for 6 months, and utterly alone in a world that had no place for women without men to claim them. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Harding with sweat stains spreading beneath his arms, cleared his throat and addressed the crowd that had gathered in the dusty street. Florence could see the baker, the blacksmith, the saloon owner, all the respectable men of Wyatt who had watched her husband die of consumption just 6 months prior. They had been sympathetic then, bringing casseroles and offering condolences. Now they looked at her with calculation, as though she were a horse being sold for parts. "Gentlemen," Silas began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "as you know, Mrs. Pruitt here has fallen behind on her debts. Her late husband's medical expenses, combined with her inability to maintain the property, have left her with obligations she cannot meet. The bank has foreclosed on her home, and as such, we are offering her hand in marriage to settle these debts. The winning bidder will assume her financial obligations and gain a wife in return." Florence felt bile rise in her throat. This was not how she had imagined her life would unfold when she had married Thomas Pruitt 3 years ago. They had been young and hopeful, planning to build a ranch, raise children, grow old together watching sunsets over the Medicine Bow Mountains. Then Thomas had taken sick, and everything had unraveled like a poorly woven blanket. She scanned the crowd, recognizing faces but finding no warmth in any of them. There was Marcus Webb, who ran the general store and who had a reputation for beating his first wife before she died in childbirth. There was Donald Porter, nearly 60 years old, already widowed twice, looking for a third wife to warm his bed and cook his meals. There were others too, none of them appealing, all of them looking at her with varying degrees of interest or disdain. "Do I hear an opening bid?" Silas called out. Silence. The wind picked up, blowing dust devils down the main street. A tumbleweed rolled past the auction block. Florence felt her face burn with humiliation. To be put up for auction was degrading enough, but to have no one even bid felt like the final insult the universe could deliver. Silas cleared his throat again, this time with obvious discomfort. "Gentlemen, this is a good woman here. She is young, healthy, and comes from decent stock. Her late husband was well respected in this community. Still nothing." Florence saw women in the crowd whispering behind their hands, their expressions a mixture of pity and judgment. She had never been particularly popular among the other wives. She had been educated back east before coming to Wyoming with her family, and her manner of speaking, her ways of thinking, had always set her apart. Thomas had loved that about her, had encouraged her to read and share her thoughts with him. But now Thomas was gone, and those same qualities that he had cherished made her unmarketable in this harsh frontier town. "Come now," Silas pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. "The debt is only $300. Surely one of you fine gentlemen could use a wife." "She is too thin," someone called out from the crowd. Florence could not see who had spoken. "She has a sharp tongue," another voice added. "My wife told me she gave her opinions at the sewing circle as though they mattered more than scripture. I heard she refused to attend prayer meetings after Thomas died," a woman said loudly. "That shows a lack of moral character." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had missed those prayer meetings because she had been working herself to exhaustion trying to keep the small farm going, trying to harvest enough to sell, to feed herself, to stave off this very moment. But no one wanted to hear about that. Silas wiped his brow with a handkerchief. The debt must be settled, gentlemen. If no one bids, she will be sent to the territorial prison for debt. Is that what we want? A woman locked up when she could be contributing to our community as a good wife, the crowd murmured, but still no one spoke up. Florence felt her knees beginning to shake. Prison. She had not allowed herself to think about that possibility, but now it loomed before her, dark and terrifying. She had heard stories about what happened to women in those places, stories that made her blood run cold. From the back of the crowd, movement caught her eye. A man was standing, tall and lean, with shoulders broad from hard work. He wore dusty trail clothes and a hat pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. Florence could not recall having seen him before, which was unusual in a town as small as Wyatt. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of them. The man did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, his presence somehow commanding attention despite his stillness. The crowd began to turn, noticing him as well. Florence watched as he removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into distant horizons. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. "Florence," he said, and his voice carried clear and steady across the crowd. Just her name, spoken with such certainty, such quiet conviction that it seemed to change the very air around them. Silas perked up immediately. "Do we have a bidder? Sir, are you bidding on Mrs. Pruitt?" The man's eyes, a striking blue even from a distance, remained fixed on Florence. "I will pay her debt," he said. "All of it, and I will marry her if she is willing." The crowd erupted in whispers. Silas looked delighted, sensing a resolution to this uncomfortable situation. "Excellent. The debt is $300, as I mentioned. Can you pay that sum?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He walked through the parting crowd, his boots making solid sounds against the packed earth, until he reached the auction block. Up close, Florence could see that his eyes were indeed blue, the color of a Wyoming sky in winter, clear and piercing. There was something familiar about him, though she could not place what. He counted out the money into Silas's eager hands, never once looking away from Florence. $300, he confirmed. "And your name, sir?" Silas asked, suddenly remembering propriety. "Frank Quinn," the man said, and suddenly Florence remembered. Frank Quinn had been a boy when she had first arrived in Wyatt 7 years ago. He had been younger than her by a few years, perhaps 17 to her 16. A quiet ranch hand who worked on her father's spread before her father had lost everything in a bad winter and moved back east, leaving Florence behind to marry Thomas. Frank had been the kind of boy no one noticed, always in the background, doing his work without complaint, never causing trouble or drawing attention. She remembered him now, recalled how he used to watch her when he thought she was not looking, how he would always volunteer for tasks that might bring him near the main house where she lived. She had been kind to him, had sometimes brought him lemonade when he worked in the hot sun, had thanked him for his help. But she had never thought of him romantically, had been too young and too focused on her own life to notice the devotion in his eyes. "Frank Quinn," she said softly, testing the name on her lips. His expression shifted slightly, something that might have been hope flickering across his features. "You remember me?" "I do," she confirmed. "You worked for my father." "I did." He turned to Silas. "The debt is paid." "What happens now?" Silas pocketed the money quickly, as though afraid Frank might change his mind. Well, traditionally, a wedding would be arranged. The reverend can perform the ceremony today if both parties are willing. Frank looked back at Florence. I would like to speak with her, privately, before any decisions are made. This was unexpected. Silas frowned, clearly wanting to close this deal as quickly as possible. Sir, you have paid the debt. She is obligated to marry you now. No, Frank said firmly. I paid her debt. That does not make her my property. I would like to speak with Florence, and then she can decide if she wants to marry me or not. The crowd stirred again, this time with confusion and curiosity. This was not how these things typically went. Florence felt something unfurl in her chest, something that had been tightly coiled for months. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just surprise that someone was treating her like a person with choices rather than a commodity to be traded. Very well, Silas said reluctantly. You may use the church for your discussion, but make it quick. We have other business to attend to today. Frank offered Florence his hand to help her down from the auction block. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip steady and sure. She stepped down, her legs trembling slightly from having stood rigid for so long, and allowed him to guide her through the parting crowd toward the small white church at the end of the street. The whispers followed them, speculation and judgment flowing like water. Florence kept her gaze straight ahead, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, on maintaining what little dignity she had left. Frank walked beside her, not touching her beyond that initial hand clasp, but his presence felt like a shield between her and the hostile gazes. The church was blessedly cool and empty, smelling of old wood and candle wax. Frank closed the door behind them, muffling the sounds from outside. Florence walked to one of the pews and sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright was draining away, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. Frank did not sit immediately. He stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, studying her with those impossibly blue eyes. Finally, he spoke. I am sorry for what happened out there. That was cruel and unnecessary. Florence let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. You have nothing to apologize for. You are the only one who showed me any kindness. I should have stepped forward sooner, he said, his jaw tightening. I should not have let them humiliate you like that. Why did you not? She asked, genuinely curious. Frank turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that spoke of nervousness despite his otherwise calm demeanor. I was not sure you would remember me, or if you did, whether you would want my help. I am not much, Florence. I am just a cowboy who has been drifting from ranch to ranch, saving money where I can. $300 is most of what I have in this world. Then why spend it on me? Florence asked, needing to understand. He met her eyes directly. Because I have thought about you every day for the past 7 years. Because when I heard about Thomas dying, I thought about coming back to Wyatt, but I wanted to have something to offer you first. I wanted to be worthy of you. And then I heard about the auction, and I rode 3 days straight to get here, hoping I would not be too late. The honesty in his words took Florence's breath away. You have been thinking about me for 7 years. Since the first day I saw you, Frank confirmed. You were standing in your father's garden, wearing a blue dress, reading a book. You looked up when I rode in, and you smiled at me like I was someone worth smiling at, not just a dusty ranch hand. I knew then that I would never feel that way about anyone else. Florence felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different from the tears of humiliation she had fought earlier. I was married, she said softly, to Thomas. I loved him. I know, Frank said, and there was no jealousy in his voice, only understanding. Thomas was a good man. He made you happy, I could see that, and I was glad for it, even though it meant I could not have you. I would rather you be happy with someone else than miserable with me. And now? Florence asked. now that he is gone. Frank took a few steps closer, close enough that she could see the earnestness in his expression, the vulnerability he was allowing her to witness. Now I am asking if you would consider starting a new life with me, not because you have to, but because you want to. I paid your debt because I could not stand the thought of you being forced into something terrible, but I will not force you into anything either. If you want to marry me, I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy. If you do not, I will help you get to wherever you want to go, set you up with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. You would do that? Florence asked, incredulous. You would pay my debt and then just let me leave? Yes, Frank said simply. Your happiness matters more to me than my own desires. It always has. Florence stood, her legs steadier now, and walked to where Frank stood. She looked up at him, really studied his face. She could see the boy he had been in the man he had become, could trace the familiar features beneath the weathering of time and experience. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, brief and bright as a shooting star. She thought about the loneliness of the past 6 months, the struggle, the fear, and she thought about the future, about what it might hold. I will not lie to you, Frank, she said carefully. I do not love you, not the way I love Thomas. I barely know you as a man, only as the boy you used to be. I understand, Frank said, though she could see the flicker of pain in his eyes. But, Florence continued, reaching out to touch his arm lightly, I could learn to love you. You have shown me more respect and kindness in the past hour than anyone has in months. You spoke my name like it mattered, like I mattered. And I remember that boy who used to watch me with such sweet adoration, who worked so hard, who never asked for anything in return for his kindness. If that boy has grown into this man standing before me, then I think perhaps we could build something good together. Frank's expression transformed, hope dawning like sunrise across his features. You mean it? You will marry me? I will, Florence said, and as she spoke the words, she felt something settle inside her, a sense of rightness she had not expected. Not because I have to, but because I choose to. Because I believe you when you say you will try to make me happy, and I promise to do the same for you. Frank's smile was like nothing Florence had ever seen before, pure and unguarded and full of joy. I will not let you regret this, he said fervently. I swear to you, Florence, I will spend my life proving that you made the right choice. Before she could respond, he took her hand, more boldly this time, and raised it to his lips. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, completely at odds with his dusty cowboy appearance, and it made Florence's heart flutter unexpectedly. Perhaps this would not be so difficult after all, learning to love this man who had loved her from afar for so long. They were married that afternoon in the same church where they had talked, with the Reverend presiding and Silas and his wife serving as witnesses. Florence wore the same dress she had worn to the auction, a simple brown calico that had seen better days. Frank stood beside her in his trail clothes, having nothing better to wear, but he held himself with such quiet dignity that clothes seemed irrelevant. The ceremony was brief. The Reverend, an elderly man named Pastor Williams who had known Florence since her arrival in Wyatt, looked at her with concern throughout the proceedings. Are you certain about this child? He asked her quietly before beginning. I can delay things if you need more time. Florence appreciated his concern, but she shook her head. I am certain, Pastor. Mr. Quinn is a good man. I believe this is the right choice. Pastor Williams did not look entirely convinced, but he proceeded with the ceremony. Frank spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love and cherish Florence for as long as he lived. When it was Florence's turn, she was surprised to find that the words came easily, that she meant them more than she had expected to. I, Florence Pruitt, take you, Frank Quinn, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by your side, to build a life with you, to honor and respect you all the days of my life." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Frank looked at Florence with such tenderness that she felt her breath catch. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly, so only she could hear. The fact that he asked, that he gave her the choice even in this, made Florence's answer easy. "Yes." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and pressed his lips to hers gently. It was a chaste kiss, appropriate for the setting, but Florence could feel the carefully restrained emotion behind it. The years of longing Frank had channeled into this one brief moment. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright, and Florence found herself smiling despite everything. Outside the church, the curious crowd had mostly dispersed, having other things to do now that the spectacle was over. A few people remained, including Marcus Webb, who looked disappointed that Florence had escaped his potential clutches. Frank ignored them all, focusing only on Florence. "I have a room at the boarding house," he said. "It is not much, but we can stay there tonight while we figure out what comes next." Florence nodded, grateful to have someone else making decisions for a moment. She had been carrying everything alone for so long that it felt strange to have someone to lean on, even slightly. They walked together through the dusty streets of Wyatt, Frank carrying the small bag that contained all of Florence's remaining possessions, things she had managed to salvage before the bank took her house. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, raised her eyebrows when Frank arrived with a wife, but she said nothing, simply accepting the extra payment Frank offered for a larger room. The room she showed them to was on the second floor, with a window overlooking the main street and a bed that was narrow but clean. After Mrs. Henderson left, Florence and Frank stood awkwardly in the small space, the reality of their situation suddenly very apparent. They were married, legally and in the eyes of God, but they were still strangers in so many ways. Frank cleared his throat. "I will sleep on the floor," he said quickly. "I do not expect anything from you, Florence, not until you are ready, if you ever are." This small kindness, this respect for her comfort, made Florence's eyes sting with tears for the third time that day. "Thank you," she whispered. Frank nodded and began arranging his bedroll on the floor beside the bed. Florence changed into her nightgown behind the privacy screen in the corner, her hands shaking slightly. When she emerged, Frank had already settled onto his makeshift bed, his back turned to give her privacy as she climbed into the actual bed. The room fell silent except for the sounds of the town outside, the occasional voice or horse passing by. Florence lay staring at the ceiling, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. Everything had changed so quickly. This morning she had woken alone in a borrowed room at the church, facing an uncertain and frightening future. Now she was married to a man who claimed to have loved her for 7 years, lying in a boarding house room, legally bound to him for life. "Frank," she said softly into the darkness. "Yes." His voice came immediately, alert, as though he had not been sleeping either. "Tell me about the past 7 years. Where you have been, what you have done. I want to know who you are now." She heard him shift on the floor, imagined him rolling to face the ceiling as she was. "After your father's ranch failed and I lost my position, I headed south," he began, his voice quiet but clear. "I worked on ranches in Colorado for a while, learning everything I could about cattle and horses. Then I went further south to New Mexico Territory, worked there for a couple of years. I saved every dollar I could, thinking that maybe one day I would have enough to buy my own piece of land, build something permanent." "Why did you not?" Florence asked. "Because it never felt right," Frank admitted. "I would look at land, Imagine building a house, starting a herd, and I could never picture it complete. There was always something missing. Someone missing. I told myself I was being foolish, that I needed to forget about you and move on with my life. I even tried courting a girl in Santa Fe for a while, a sweet girl named Maria, whose father owned the ranch where I worked. Florence felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy. What happened? I could not do it, Frank said simply. I could not pretend to feel something I did not. It was not fair to her. So I ended things and moved on, kept drifting, kept working. I heard news from Wyoming occasionally, heard that you had married Thomas Pruitt. That was a hard day, knowing for certain that you belonged to someone else. But I was glad too, glad that you had found someone that you would be taken care of. And when he died, Florence asked softly. I heard about it 3 months after it happened, Frank said, and she could hear the regret in his voice. I was in Denver by then, working at a stockyard. I thought about coming back immediately, but I did not know if it would be appropriate, if you would even want to see me. Then last week, I heard about the auction. A man who had passed through Wyatt was talking about it in a saloon, laughing about how the proud widow was going to be sold off. I left that night, rode as hard as I could to get here in time. Florence absorbed this, trying to imagine Frank sitting in some distant saloon, hearing about her humiliation, making the decision to race to her rescue. You could have been too late, she said. You could have ridden all that way for nothing. Then at least I would have tried, Frank replied. I have spent 7 years not trying, not taking chances where you were concerned. I was not going to make that mistake again. They fell silent for a while. Florence thought about the kind of man who would do what Frank had done, who would spend years working and waiting and hoping, who would risk everything on the chance of saving someone he loved. She thought about Thomas, who had been good and kind but also practical, who would not have understood this level of romantic devotion. Frank's love was different, deeper perhaps, or at least more enduring. I will try to be a good wife to you, Florence said finally. I cannot promise love, not yet, but I can promise effort. I can promise honesty and respect and companionship. That is more than enough, Frank said, and she could hear the emotion in his voice. That is more than I ever hoped for. They settled into silence again, and this time Florence felt sleep beginning to claim her. For the first time in 6 months, she felt safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions to be made about where they would go and what they would do, but for tonight, she could rest. The next morning brought sunshine streaming through the window and the smell of breakfast cooking downstairs. Florence woke to find Frank already up, dressed, and standing by the window looking out at the street. He turned when he heard her stir, and his smile was gentle. "Good morning," he said. "I thought I would let you sleep. You looked like you needed it." Florence sat up, pushing her hair back from her face. She felt more rested than she had in weeks, despite the strangeness of the situation. "What time is it?" "About 8, Frank said. "I have been thinking about what we should do next. I have a little money left after paying your debt, enough to get us started somewhere new if you want to leave Wyatt. Or we could stay, try to make a go of it here. It is your choice." Florence considered this carefully. Wyatt held painful memories now, the humiliation of the auction, the loss of Thomas, the coldness of people she had thought were friends. But it was also familiar, and starting over somewhere completely new felt daunting. "Where would we go?" she asked. Frank came to sit on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "I was thinking maybe Montana Territory. I know a man up there who runs a big spread, told me once he would have worked for me if I ever wanted it. The pay is good, and there is land to be had for those willing to homestead. We could build something together, something that is ours." The idea had appeal. Montana meant a fresh start, a place where no one knew her as the pitiful widow who had been auctioned off. It meant the possibility of building a real life with Frank without the shadow of the past constantly looming over them. "How long would it take to get there?" Florence asked. "A few weeks by wagon," Frank said. "We would need to buy supplies, a wagon, horses. It would take most of my remaining money, but I think we could make it work." Florence made her decision. "Let us go to Montana. There is nothing for me here in Wyatt anymore. I would rather start fresh somewhere new with you." Frank's face lit up with that same unguarded joy she had seen in the church. "You are certain?" "I am," Florence confirmed, and she was. Whatever lay ahead in Montana, it had to be better than staying in a place where everyone looked at her with pity or contempt. They spent the next week preparing for the journey. Frank proved to be both resourceful and practical, finding a sturdy wagon at a good price, purchasing supplies that would last them for the trip, negotiating for 2 strong horses and a mule. Florence watched him work, impressed by his competence, and the way other men seemed to respect him despite his youth. He had an air of quiet authority that came from years of hard work and knowing his own capabilities. During that week, they began to learn each other in small ways. Frank insisted on asking Florence's opinion about everything they purchased, from the type of flour to the color of the canvas for the wagon cover. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and considered her thoughts carefully before making decisions. It was a novelty for Florence, this sense of being truly heard. Thomas had loved her, but he had also been a man of his time, expecting his wife to defer to his judgment in most matters. Frank seemed to genuinely value her input. In turn, Florence began to notice things about Frank. The way he always made sure she ate first before taking his own meal. How he would position himself between her and any potential threat, whether it was a drunk stumbling out of a saloon or a wagon careening too quickly down the street. The small smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he caught her looking at him. The gentleness of his hands when he helped her into the wagon, as though she were something precious that might break. On their 4th evening in Wyatt, as they sat in the boarding house dining room eating supper, Marcus Webb approached their table. Florence tensed immediately, remembering the way he had looked at her during the auction, but Frank simply set down his fork and looked up calmly at the other man. "Quinn," Marcus said, his tone aggressive, "I heard you are leaving town." "That is correct," Frank replied evenly. "We are heading to Montana Territory." Marcus's gaze slid to Florence, and there was something ugly in his expression. "Seems a shame dragging her off to the wilderness. A woman like that needs civilization, needs to be around proper people." "A woman like my wife needs respect and kindness," Frank said, his voice still calm but with an edge to it now. "Things she will not find here, it seems." Marcus's face reddened. "You calling me disrespectful?" "I am saying that Florence is my wife now, and I will protect her from anyone who would treat her poorly. That includes men who bid on her like she was livestock, or who stood by and watched it happen without objecting." The room had gone quiet, other diners watching the confrontation with interest. Florence held her breath, afraid this might escalate into violence, but Frank's steady gaze never wavered from Marcus's face. Finally, Marcus looked away. "You are making a mistake," he muttered. "That woman is more trouble than she is worth." "That is where you are wrong," Frank said quietly. "She is worth more than you could possibly understand." Marcus left without another word, and the normal sounds of the dining room gradually resumed. Florence reached across the table and touched Frank's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Frank turned his hand to clasp hers gently. "You never need to thank me for treating you the way you deserve to be treated, Florence. That is just basic decency." But it was more than basic decency, Florence was beginning to realize. It was love, the kind that showed itself in actions rather than words, in 1,000 small protections and kindnesses. She was not in love with Frank yet, but she was starting to feel something, a warmth in her chest when she looked at him, a sense of security she had not felt since Thomas died. They left Wyatt on a clear morning in early September, the wagon packed with supplies and the horses fresh and eager. Florence took one last look at the town as they rolled out, seeing the church steeple, the general store, the saloon. She thought about Thomas buried in the cemetery on the hill, and she said a silent goodbye to the life she had imagined they would have together. Then she turned her face forward, toward Montana and whatever the future held. The journey north was long but not unpleasant. Frank had mapped out a route that would take them through relatively settled areas where they could resupply and rest. Each day followed a similar pattern. Frank would wake before dawn and start a fire, make coffee, and then gently wake Florence. They would eat breakfast, pack up camp, and travel until midday. Then they would stop for a simple lunch, rest the horses, and continue until evening. At night, Frank would make camp while Florence prepared supper from their supplies, and they would sit by the fire talking until it was time to sleep. Frank continued to sleep apart from Florence, rolling out his bedroll under the wagon while she slept inside it. He never complained, never pushed for more than she was ready to give. But there were moments when Florence caught him looking at her with such longing that her heart ached for him. She began to wonder why she was still holding back, why she was denying them both something they were legally and morally entitled to as husband and wife. The truth was, she was afraid. Afraid of betraying Thomas's memory, afraid of not being able to love Frank the way he deserved, afraid of opening her heart only to have it broken again. But as the days passed and the miles accumulated, she began to see that fear was holding her prisoner. Thomas was gone, and he would not want her to spend the rest of her life alone and afraid. Frank was here, devoted and patient and kind, asking nothing but giving everything. One evening, about 2 weeks into their journey, they made camp near a small stream in a grove of cottonwood trees. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the sound of the water was soothing. Florence prepared their supper while Frank tended to the horses, and they ate in companionable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. After they finished eating, Frank started to set up his bedroll under the wagon as usual. Florence watched him for a moment, then made her decision. "Frank," she said softly. He looked up from his task. "Yes. Would you sleep in the wagon tonight, with me?" Frank froze, his hands stilling on the bedroll. "Florence, you do not have to do that. I do not want you to feel obligated." "I do not feel obligated," Florence said, and she realized it was true. "I feel like I am ready to be your wife in all ways if you still want that." Frank crossed to where she sat in 2 long strides. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Are you certain? I have waited this long. I can wait longer if you need more time." Florence looked into his blue eyes, saw the love and desire and hope there, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. "I am certain," she said. "I want to move forward, Frank, with you, not as 2 strangers sharing a wagon, but as husband and wife." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and kissed her. This kiss was different from the chaste peck at their wedding. It was deeper, more passionate, but still gentle, still asking rather than demanding. Florence kissed him back, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She felt his hand come up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek tenderly. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. "I have loved you for so long, Florence. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." "I know," Florence whispered back. "And I am starting to love you too, Frank. Not the same way I loved Thomas, but something different, something that feels right. They made love that night in the wagon, with the stars shining through the canvas opening and the sound of the stream providing a gentle backdrop. Frank was tender and patient, treating Florence as though she were made of glass, constantly asking if she was all right, if she wanted him to stop. Florence found herself moved by his care, by the way he put her pleasure and comfort above his own desires. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the narrow wagon bed, she felt closer to him than she had ever felt to anyone. "Thank you," Frank murmured into her hair. "For trusting me, for giving us a chance." Florence pressed a kiss to his chest, feeling his heart beating steady and strong beneath her lips. "Thank you for waiting, for being patient, for loving me even when I could not love you back." "I would wait forever for you," Frank said simply, and Florence believed him. After that night, their relationship changed. There was more laughter, more touches, more of the small intimacies that mark a true marriage. Frank would reach for Florence's hand as they walked, or she would lean against him as they sat by the fire. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. Florence told Frank about her childhood back east, about the books she loved to read, about her hope to one day have children who would grow up in a world less harsh than the one she had known. Frank told her about his own childhood, growing up poor with a father who drank and a mother who died young, about his determination to make something of himself, to build a life worth living. They reached Montana Territory in late September, arriving in the town of Bozeman just as the leaves were beginning to turn gold and red. It was a rougher, newer place than Wyatt, full of miners and ranchers and opportunists, all trying to make their fortunes in this untamed land. But it also felt full of possibility, a place where the past did not matter as much as what you could build for the future. Frank's contact, a rancher named William Garrett, welcomed them warmly and was delighted to offer Frank a job as a ranch foreman. The position came with a small cabin on the property, nothing fancy but solidly built, with 2 rooms and a real stove. To Florence, who had been sleeping in a wagon for weeks, it looked like a palace. They moved in immediately, and Florence set about making the cabin into a home. She sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town, arranged their meager possessions to best advantage, planted a small garden despite the lateness of the season. Frank worked long hours on the ranch, but he always came home to her, always greeted her with a kiss and asked about her day, always treated her like she was the most important thing in his world. As autumn turned to winter and the Montana snows began to fall, Florence realized she was happy. Truly, deeply happy in a way she had not been since before Thomas took sick. She loved Frank, loved him in a way that was different from what she had felt for Thomas, but no less real. Thomas had been her first love, sweet and uncomplicated and bright. Frank was her second love, deeper and more mature, built on respect and trust and shared struggle. One evening in December, as they sat by the fire in their cabin, Florence had news to share. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be certain before saying anything. Now, watching Frank whittle a piece of wood into some shape only he could envision, she knew it was time. "Frank," she said, setting down the shirt she was mending, "I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately attentive to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," Florence said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. I am going to have a baby, Frank. We are going to have a baby." The piece of wood clattered to the floor as Frank stared at her, his mouth open in shock. Then his face transformed with pure joy, and he was across the room in an instant, pulling her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby. Florence, are you certain?" "I am certain," she confirmed, laughing at his reaction. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Frank pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining with tears. "Florence, I am more than happy. I am blessed. I am the luckiest man alive. I have you, and now we are going to have a child. How could I be anything but ecstatic?" He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Florence felt her heart swell with love for this man who had waited so patiently for her, who had saved her from a fate worse than death, who had shown her what real love looked like. The winter passed slowly, as Montana winters do, with deep snows and bitter cold. But the cabin stayed warm, and Frank made sure Florence had everything she needed. He became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavy or venture out in the snow without him. Florence found his protectiveness endearing rather than stifling, knowing it came from a place of deep love and concern. In the spring, as the snows melted and the wildflowers began to bloom across the Montana prairie, Florence gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the ranch owner's wife, Mrs. Garrett, who had experience with such things. Frank paced outside the cabin, wearing a path in the mud, until finally he heard the cry of his child. When Mrs. Garrett called him in, he found Florence propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with such love that Frank felt his knees go weak. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Frank approached almost reverently, looking down at the tiny face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, when they briefly opened, were blue like his father's. Frank felt something shift in his chest, a love so profound it almost hurt. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "You are both perfect. What should we name him?" Florence had been thinking about this for months. "I want to name him Thomas," she said. "After my first husband. I hope that does not hurt you, Frank, but Thomas was a good man, and I want to honor his memory. He would have been a wonderful father if he had lived." Frank felt tears prick his eyes, moved by Florence's generosity of spirit, by her ability to love both past and present without diminishing either. "Thomas is a perfect name," he said hoarsely. "Thomas Frank Quinn." Florence smiled. "Yes. Thomas Frank Quinn. That is exactly right." As Frank held his son for the first time, feeling the tiny weight of him, the absolute trust, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the auction block in Wyatt, about Florence standing there with her chin up and her eyes fierce. He thought about speaking her name, about seeing recognition, and then hope dawn in her eyes. He thought about the long journey to Montana, the slow building of trust and then love, the miracle of this woman choosing him when she could have chosen freedom. "I will be a good father," Frank promised Florence quietly. "I will be a good husband. I will spend every day trying to deserve this gift you have given me." "You already deserve it," Florence said, reaching out to touch his face. "You have always deserved it, Frank. I am just sorry it took me so long to see it." They raised their son in that small cabin. And then, as the years passed and Frank was promoted to co-owner of the ranch, in a larger house they built on their own piece of land. 2 more children followed Thomas, a daughter named Sarah when Thomas was 3, and another son named Joseph 2 years after that. Florence watched Frank with their children and fell more in love with him every day. He was patient and kind, teaching them to ride and read with equal enthusiasm. He told them stories by the fire on winter nights, taught them the value of hard work and honesty, showed them what it meant to treat others with respect and dignity. The years passed peacefully. The ranch prospered under Frank's management, and he and Florence became respected members of the Bozeman community. They made friends, attended church socials, helped their neighbors when times were hard. Florence started a small school for the ranch children, teaching them reading and arithmetic in the same cabin where Thomas had been born. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch watching the sunset over the mountains, Florence would think about how different her life might have been. If Frank had not come to Wyatt that day, if he had not spoken her name with such conviction, she might have ended up married to a cruel man like Marcus Webb, or worse, sent to prison. Instead, she had this: a loving husband, 3 healthy children, a home and community and purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Frank would ask, seeing the faraway look in her eyes. "About how lucky I am," Florence would say, and she would take his hand, weathered now from years of ranch work but still gentle when it touched her. "About how you saved me, Frank. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Frank would reply, as he always did. "I was just existing before you, Florence. You gave me a reason to live, a reason to become the best man I could be. Everything good in my life comes from loving you." When Thomas was 10, Sarah 7, and Joseph 5, they added one more member to their family, a daughter they named Grace, a late and unexpected blessing. Frank was 40 by then, Florence 36, and they had thought their family was complete. But Grace arrived anyway, a tiny thing with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, and she was adored from her first breath. The children grew, as children do. Thomas became a rancher like his father, eventually taking over the management of the Quinn spread. Sarah married a schoolteacher and moved to Helena, where she started her own school for girls. Joseph became a veterinarian, studying back east before returning to Montana to practice. Grace, the baby, surprised everyone by becoming a writer, publishing stories in national magazines about life in the Montana Territory. Through it all, Frank and Florence remained devoted to each other. They weathered hard times when drought killed cattle or harsh winters threatened the ranch. They celebrated good times when the herd flourished and the children succeeded. They supported each other through loss when William Garrett died, and then, years later, when Mrs. Garrett followed him. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with age, but their love never diminishing. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Frank surprised Florence with a trip back to Wyoming. Thomas and his wife stayed at the ranch with Grace, who was still unmarried at 18, and Frank drove Florence south in a new automobile he had purchased the year before, one of the few concessions he had made to modern convenience. They visited Wyatt, which had grown some but was still recognizably the same town where they had married. The church was still there, though Pastor Williams had long since passed. The boarding house where they had spent their first night together was now a bank. They stood in the main street, trying to remember exactly where the auction block had been. "Right there, I think," Florence said, pointing to a spot now occupied by a hitching post. "That is where I stood, thinking my life was over. That is where I saw you and knew I would do anything to save you," Frank said, putting his arm around her waist. "Best decision I ever made, standing up that day." They spent the night in a hotel that had not existed when they lived in Wyatt, and then drove north the next morning. As they passed the spot where they had made camp that first night Florence had come to his bed, they both smiled, remembering. "Have I told you today that I love you?" Frank asked, reaching over to take Florence's hand. "Only 3 times," Florence replied, squeezing his fingers. "But I will never tire of hearing it. I love you too, Frank Quinn, more than I ever thought possible to love another person." They lived 20 more years after that trip. 20 years of watching their grandchildren be born and grow, of continuing to work the ranch even as their bodies slowed, of sitting on their porch in the evenings holding hands and counting their blessings. Frank died peacefully in his sleep at 73, with Florence beside him. Florence followed exactly 1 year later to the day, as though she had been waiting just long enough to put her affairs in order before joining him. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, with a headstone that read, "Frank and Florence Quinn." He spoke her name. She gave him her heart, together forever. Their children and grandchildren stood at the funeral, telling stories about the devoted couple who had built such a strong legacy of love and respect. Thomas, gray-haired now and a grandfather himself, told his own children about how their grandfather had once ridden 3 days straight to save their grandmother from a terrible fate, how he had paid everything he had to set her free, how he had loved her patiently until she could love him back. "That is real love," Thomas told his grandchildren as they stood by the graves. "Not the quick, easy kind, but the kind that endures, that waits, that puts the other person first. That is what your great-grandparents had, and that is what they taught all of us." The story of Frank and Florence became a family legend, passed down through generations. Great-grandchildren who never knew them still heard about the auction in Wyatt, about the quiet cowboy who spoke the widow's name, about the love that grew from respect and patience into something that lasted a lifetime. And on quiet evenings on that Montana ranch, when the wind blew through the grass and the sun set behind the mountains, some said you could still feel their presence there, the love they had built together lingering in the land they had tamed, the home they had made, the family they had created. It was a love that had started with a single word, a name spoken with conviction in a moment of crisis, and it had bloomed into something that would never truly end, echoing through time in the hearts of all who came after. The end.